In 2016, Joe Biden was asked whether or not he regretted supporting the 1994 crime bill, which led to mass incarceration primarily of people of color, and he made it very clear that he did not regret supporting the crime bill. In fact, he defended the crime bill in 2016.
Another thing about how perspectives change over time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, "I'm ashamed that I voted for the 94 crime bill." You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. In fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
There are things I would change. I opposed, for example, the carjacking provision that the administration wanted in. But by and large, what it really did, it restored American cities.
So to still defend the crime bill in 2016 after he saw how Hillary Clinton was taking a lot of flack for supporting the crime bill, he still defended the crime bill. And if you know anything about Joe Biden, that's not necessarily too surprising because he's been consistently tough on crime throughout the entirety of his career. Now, a video from 1989 of Joe Biden recently resurfaced, and he took a stance that's so tough on crime that he outflanked then Republican President George H.W. Bush from the right and wanted him to be even more tough on crime, and was critical of George H.W. Bush because he wasn't tough enough on crime. So let's hear what he said back then, and then it's going to make sense as to why Joe Biden still defended the crime bill up until 2016.
I think the president has to join us in making a significantly greater commitment to these 6 areas to stem the rising tide of violence in America. And that's what it is, violence. First, we have to join together to ensure that drug dealers are punished swiftly, surely, and severely. And in line with what the president is calling for, we have to hold every drug user accountable. Because if there were no drug users, there would be no appetite for drugs and there'd be no market for them. Let's take a look at what the real problem is. It's not just how many people are using drugs. As the president said, the number of people using drugs, cocaine in particular, is down in our country. That's true. But the violence associated with drugs is spewing out all over America. And that's terrible. I know it's hard to believe, but this very day, violent drug offenders will commit more than 100,000 crimes on this day alone. And the sad part is that we have no more police in the streets of our major cities than we had 10 years ago. And what the president proposes won't help much. What he proposes is no increase over what the Congress has already approved last year. In a nutshell, the president's plan doesn't include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs, not enough prosecutors to convict them, not enough judges to sentence them, and not enough prison cells to put them away for a long time. That's why right now, 6 out of every 10 criminals who are arrested on drug charges have their cases dropped. That's why we think the president should triple the commitment that he's made tonight for police, prosecutors, and judges for our cities and our states. We disagree with the president's decision to cut back on our previous commitment to protect against drugs coming across the border, to cut the Customs Service, the Coast Guard, and the Border Patrol. We think we should do more to stem the flow of drugs across our borders, and we think we should go one step further. Let's go after the drug lords where they live, with an international strike force. There must be no safe haven for these narco-terrorists, and they must know it.
Yikes. So to give you the context here, that was a Democrat outflanking the Republican president from his right, advocating for a war on drugs that's comparable to what we now see when it comes to the war on terror, an international war on drugs. That's what he advocated for. So when it comes to being tough on crime, it's clear nobody was tougher on crime than Joe Biden. But fast forward to 2019, and here's what he's saying now about his former tough on crime stance. Quote, "I haven't always been right on criminal justice." You don't say. I mean, what a convenient time to have such an epiphany, Joe. You're totally saying this because you had this genuine evolution and, you're not taking this stance for purposes of political expediency now, are you, Joe?
Makes sense.
Oh,
So, yeah, I think it's clear that his formerly tough on crime position is unpalatable to some people on the left. And if you actually want to have a chance of making it through a Democratic Party primary, you've got to adapt and you've got to reflect the current Democratic Party base. Maybe back then in 1989, that was acceptable to the left, but in 2019, Joe Biden is at least politically astute enough to know that if he wants to even have a chance, he can't continue with this tough on crime position that's a proven failure. The crime bill is a failure. Now, he's going to address his stance towards criminal justice and his former tough on crime position, but he's not going to directly say anything about the crime bill. So here's what he says now. As CNN's Arlette Saenz explains, former Vice President Joe Biden said in remarks at a Martin Luther King Jr. breakfast Monday that he has made mistakes when it comes to criminal justice issues, an area of his career that could be scrutinized if he launches a 2020 presidential bid in a competitive Democratic field. You know, I've been fighting in this fight for a long time. It goes not just to voting rights, it goes to the criminal justice system, Biden said at the National Action Network's Martin Luther King Jr. breakfast in Washington. I haven't always been right. I know we haven't always gotten things right, but I've always tried. Biden made no mention of his support for a 1994 crime bill that set strict sentencing standards and critics have argued led to an era of mass incarceration, but he highlighted his later work with President Barack Obama to address the sentencing disparity for crack versus powder cocaine. It was a big mistake when it was made, he said. We thought we were told by the experts that crack, you never go back. It was somehow fundamentally different. It's not different, but it's trapped an entire generation. The former vice president also argued that white Americans must acknowledge systemic racism still exists. There's something we have to admit, not you, we, white America, has to admit there's still a systematic racism and it goes almost unnoticed by so many of us, he said. Biden's speech, made on Martin Luther King Jr. Day before a group founded by the Reverend Al Sharpton, serves as a possible overture to black voters as he molds a 2020 presidential run. So, I mean, I'll give him credit where it's due. You can't talk about the problem and address the problem of mass incarceration unless you admit that there's a problem in the first place. And certainly, if you were someone who was instrumental in creating that problem, you have to admit culpability. And what this was here was an admission of guilt to a degree. Not perfect by any means, but certainly he's admitting that conveniently in 2019, he's suddenly realizing that, you know, maybe he wasn't always right when it comes to crime, criminal justice, and his previous stances with regard to the 1994 crime bill. So understand that we're going to see a lot of Democrats suddenly evolve on things that aren't going to help them going into 2020. If you didn't support Medicare for All in 2016, then you sure the fuck do now. If you didn't renounce the 1994 crime bill in 2016, you sure the fuck do now. Meanwhile, though, Bernie Sanders doesn't really have to renounce anything because he's had the same policy positions for decades. So, I mean, to me, it doesn't even make sense why there's a debate. If you are on the left, there's no question about who the leftist candidate is. It's Bernie Sanders. He didn't have to evolve on Medicare for All. He talked about this for decades. He didn't have to evolve on the crime bill. He's talked about this for decades. So as we see a bunch of politicians running in 2020 have this sudden evolution in their personal feelings about the crime bill and Medicare for All, understand this. There's one candidate in this race that has been consistent for the totality of his career. Now, I don't think you're going to find anyone else with more foresight than that. And heading into the post-Trump era, which I hope will come to fruition in January of 2021, we need someone who is not going to get us into another mess that down the road leads to an even bigger clown than Donald Trump. And really, I'm not confident that anyone else can do that besides Bernie Sanders, because even the best candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who I consider to be top 3 in this race, alongside Bernie and Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren was a Republican in 1995. Now, I trust her, right? I believe she's on the left. But Bernie Sanders is the one person who has been entrenched in leftist politics. So during the Democratic Party primary, if you're a leftist, it doesn't make sense to me how you can opt for anyone but Bernie when knowing how all of these candidates are struggling to match his leftism and progressivism in 2020. But this just goes to show you that even people like Joe Biden know that they have to match Bernie and match others in the race if they want to be palatable to the left. And it's good overall. I'm glad that they're changing, even if it may be disingenuous, but it does show one thing about progressives. It's that we, as a whole, are getting that Overton window to shift back to the left. It's not happening quickly, right? We're making very marginal progress, if you will, but certainly when you listen to the rhetoric espoused by even establishment Democrats, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, when it comes to healthcare, education, that effect is what I like to call the Bernie Sanders effect. It's the effect of progressives having so-called purity tests and not taking any bullshit from the Democratic Party and demanding that you have to represent us. So, yeah, I'll leave that there. Certainly, it's good that Joe Biden, isn't still trying to defend the atrocious crime bill, which was a catastrophe, which led to mass incarceration and exploded the prison population. I mean, certainly, that's a positive step in the right direction, even if it may be disingenuous, but let's hear what he has to say about private prisons. Are you going to call for a ban on private prisons, Joe? Are you going to take money from them? I think you need to go further. This is just a really small step in the right direction, but we all know that Joe Biden, we can't expect too much from him because he is the worst candidate in the field in 2020. I don't think you're going to get a more conservative Democrat during the 2020 Democratic Party primary than Joe Biden. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes, but certainly he knows that his tough on crime stance is coming back to bite him in the ass, and it's not the only part of his record that will be called into question. He has other things to answer for, and Anita Hill is certainly one of them.
Subscribe if you like this video, folks. Mike's tremendous, and he's doing a really, really good job. Many people are telling me about how wonderful the Humanist Report is. Bigly.